Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Hendrik, Geyer, Director of STIAS. It's my pleasant duty to extend a warm welcome to you all at a very special event on the STIAS calendar. This evening's public lecture by Professor Joseph Stiglitz, who's University Professor in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and as you will well know, recipient of the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. So, Professor Stiglitz, a special word of welcome to you. Thank you for being with us this evening and for making common cause with the STIAS program. With so many VIPs present in this room, I run the risk to offend at least a few people if I start naming them on a list. So if you will bear with me, I will not do so and simply indicate that we very much value your presence and support this evening. Professor Stan du Plessis, former Dean of Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at Stellenbosch University, and about to shed the designate in his new role as Chief Operating Officer, will introduce Professor Stiglitz. But before I ask him to do that, allow me a few words about STIAS and its program. I want to take you back briefly to 1929, before the Wall Street crash, when Abraham Flexner, who was the founding director of the famous Princeton Institute for Advanced Study, convinced the Bamberger family to provide the funding for the creation of an institute grounded in two premises. First, that independent scholarly research was the highest form of the kind of freedom of thought that a modern society required, and second, that such research would prove to be of immense value to society. In Flexner's own words, he wanted to create an environment which should be a free society of scholars, free because mature persons animated by intellectual purposes must be left to pursue their own ends in their own ways. The Bambergers were convinced to the point that they provided $5 million in pursuit of this vision. And the economists who know how to do these calculations indicate that this translates to about $70 million in current value. Now, with the luxury of hindsight offered by history, we of course know what immense impact people like Albert Einstein, John von Neumann, and J. Robert Oppenheimer had on science and society. But if we fast forward to today, it's nevertheless clear that the world now is a totally different place to the 1930s, and society, especially in South Africa, expresses its most pressing needs in a totally different way. Nevertheless, STIAS has built its own program with a similar emphasis on excellence, combining that firstly with a focus on a growing list of pressing problems, which can best be approached through perspectives and analysis offered from a multitude of disciplines. Interdisciplinarity, therefore, in short. And secondly, by actively engaging with the next generation of researchers from Africa. Our Izolomso program, which is isiXhosa for the Eye of Tomorrow, not only offers these young researchers residency to work at STIAS over a period of 3 years, but also opens up doors for them to participate in the programs of other institutes for advanced study, including Princeton. As for STIAS projects which draw on interdisciplinarity, let me very briefly mention a few of them, starting by mentioning the fact that Oxford University Press now publishes a book series called the Stellenbosch Handbooks in African Constitutional Law, which is based on an annual Stellenbosch seminar on constitutionalism in Africa, a project which we have run over the past 5 years. And it may not come as a surprise to you that the theme of this year's seminar was Corruption and Constitutionalism in Africa, Revisiting Control Measures and Containment Strategies. 2 groups of STIAS fellows who have been active over the past few years are currently in residence, and their projects deal respectively with sustainable agro-ecosystems, which will culminate next year in a major book publication, Technologies and Policies for Sustainable Transformation of Agriculture in Southern Africa. And secondly, the developmental origins of health and disease and sustainable development goals, moving towards early implementation, which is as clear from the title, is fundamentally tied with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we have captured and elaborated on this information and much more in a recent prospectus. It looks like this. You will find copies. By the way, we call that engaging challenges across disciplines and nurturing tomorrow's thinkers. And you will find copies outside, and I invite you to take one along to find out what STIAS has been doing over the past 10 years, what its accomplishments have been, and where we are heading. And added to the list of STIAS objectives is our active pursuit of knowledge dissemination to a wider public and to decision and policy-making forums, which brings me back to the main business of this evening, because you are, of course, here to hear Professor Stiglitz speak about the revolution of information economics. And I will now call on Professor du Plessis to kindly introduce our distinguished guests. Thank you, Stan. Thank you.
Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Professor Geyer, distinguished guests. I see so many economist friends here and friends of the university. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. If this was a gathering of economists only, I could simply have raised my hand and announced, ladies and gentlemen, Joseph Stiglitz, and your applause would have carried us to the opening lines of the address. But we have a broader audience this evening, and I'm grateful for it, not just for your pleasant company, but also because it gives me the opportunity to say something more about one of the world's greatest economists. Joseph Stiglitz was born in Gary, in the state of Indiana in the United States, a city which showed the young Stiglitz that a Panglossian view of society cannot be sustained in the face of social ills such as poverty, inequality, unemployment, and discrimination. In 2017, Gary, Indiana is a city with about half the current population of Stellenbosch. So you might think it is faint praise to hear that a letter of reference on behalf of Professor Stiglitz once concluded with the assessment that he was the best economist from Gary, Indiana. But you would understand the magnitude of the compliment if you heard that the letter was written by none other than Paul Samuelson, himself from Gary, Indiana. Nobel Prize winner and perhaps the most influential economist for the last half of the 20th century. Joe was, of course, a brilliant student and has written fondly of his undergraduate memories at Amherst College in Massachusetts before he joined the graduate program at MIT, where his supervisor was Professor Uzawa, very renowned theorist, and where Paul Samuelson would become a role model later on. Joe has been a faculty member at some of the greatest departments of economics and faculties in the world, at Oxford, at Yale, at Stanford and Princeton, and is currently university professor at Columbia University. And we are very honored by his association with STIAS as a Donald Gordon STIAS Fellow. His research output has been prolific, but more than the volume, it is the impact of his work that makes it such an honor and a pleasure to welcome him to Stellenbosch. Over his distinguished career, he worked on many themes and across a number of fields. But this evening, he will talk to us about the economics of information, a field where he is a pioneer and through which he has changed modern economics, both technically and as a perspective on the world. Let me give you an example from my own experience of his work. In a famous paper with Andrew Weiss, published in the American Economic Review in 1981, Stiglitz showed how the distribution of information in financial markets can affect the outcomes of these markets dramatically and lead to a number of undesirable results, such as rationing. They drove the message home in a startling concluding paragraph, which I would like to share with you. The law of supply and demand, they wrote, is not in fact a law, nor should it be viewed as an assumption needed for competitive analysis. It is rather a result generated by the underlying assumptions that prices have neither sorting nor incentive effects. The usual result of economic theorizing, that prices clear markets, is model-specific and is not a general property of markets. Unemployment and credit rationing are not phantasms. These are startling claims, and the fact that we accept them now and use them as a matter of course is a great testimony to the impact of Joseph Stiglitz's work. As he said later in his Nobel acceptance lecture, the underlying forces of demand and supply are still important, though in the new paradigm they become only part of the analysis. They are not the whole analysis. It is for insights like these, and especially the rigorous underlying analysis, which, as we walked on the mountain on Saturday morning, Joe called lending intellectual respectability to these highly controversial ideas, that he received honors such as the John Bates Clark Medal, which is awarded to a distinguished American economist under the age of 40, and it is why he has received more than 40 honorary degrees around the world. I believe he received two more on the way here as he stopped over in Italy. And it is why he was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 2001. The Nobel Committee recognized him specifically for his pioneering work on information economics. Now, his academic work is of lasting importance, and the REPEC database for economics shows that he is currently 4th overall amongst the 51,326 ranked economists with citations around the world. But Joe has always felt a responsibility for the application of economics beyond the academic world, in public policy, and in fact, economists of my generation often was introduced to his work through the series of lectures called Lectures in Public Economics, which he co-authored with Anthony Atkinson. In South Africa, we've had the privilege to benefit from his policy advice to, amongst others, National Treasury, the South African Reserve Bank, and the Department of Economic Development. In the United States, he was chair of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, and he was also senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. And now I want to ask Professor Stiglitz to present a guest lecture this evening on a topic right from the core of his academic work, the revolution of information economics, the past and the future. Ladies and gentlemen, there really is no one better in the world to talk to us on this topic. And Joe, we are your eager audience.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's been a real pleasure to be able to spend the last week here at Stellenbosch. The topic that I'm going to talk about this evening is, as it says, information economics. But when I proposed a set of topics to talk about, including this, I actually was very happy to talk about the topic because in many ways, the issue of information and disinformation is back in the news. And so what I want to do is spend most of my time talking about some of the academic research, but I'll try to relate it to some of the things going on more recently in information and innovation economics. Well, as was mentioned, the work I got the Nobel Prize for was on the economics of information. Economists prior to my work and some of my colleagues had assumed that information was perfect. Now, economists are not so stupid as to actually believe that. Let me make that clear. But the hope was that a world in which information was not too imperfect would be well described by a model with perfect information. So it was assumed that if you analyzed a world in which information was very good or perfect, it would be a surrogate. It would give you a good approximation. There was no reason for that belief. It was more a prayer than anything else. But economists didn't have any models, any tools for analyzing what a world would look like with imperfect information. So one of my contributions was to figure out how do you describe economies with imperfect information using simple mathematics, and to do that rigorously and precisely, and how to talk about imperfect information with some degree of precision, so that you could use analytic tools and prove theorems and things like that economists do. But in the process of doing it, it turned out that almost all the beliefs of economists over the preceding 200 years were wrong. Now, that was not something that would make me a lot of friends, because to explain to people, economists who had devoted their life to a certain set of ideas, to say that you've wasted your life is never a good thing if you want to win friends. But over the last 40 some years, the weight of the research has shown that these models that we started creating 40 years ago actually worked and have a lot of explanatory power and a lot of insight, and explain a lot of phenomena that otherwise can't be explained. Towards the end, I'll talk about some of the limitations, some of our failures, which actually are part of the successes because they led to the next round of research. But let me begin by talking about probably the most important idea in economics, and that's Adam Smith's invisible hand. Adam Smith's invisible hand, for those you don't know, is the idea that individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest, firms maximizing profits, individuals maximizing utility, would be led as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. It's a very powerful result, if it were only true, because it says that you could feel good by feeling greedy, because your pursuit of self-interest would lead to the well-being of society. The only sin is not to be greedy enough. And there were people at the University of Chicago like Milton Friedman who really believed it and lived their life that way. And there's a whole school of thought, law and economics, that's predicated on that view of the world. Well, that theorem, that idea that Adam Smith articulated in his book, The Wealth of Nations, that was written in 1776, it took about 170 years for economists to prove that insight, to provide the conditions under which it was true in the precise sense in which it was true. And that was done by Kenneth Arrow of Stanford and Gerard Debreu of Berkeley. Both of them received Nobel Prizes for that work. But in the course of that proof, it turned out that there were a lot of conditions, both technical and economic conditions, that had to be satisfied. And these are important conditions, but they were in some sense limited. There were conditions like there can't be externalities like pollution. And obviously things like climate change are real, and markets don't handle those very well. So economists had a view at the time I was finished doing my graduate work. Economists had the view that markets worked well most of the time, but there were some limitations. You had to have good competition, and you couldn't have these externalities like pollution, but outside of that, markets worked well. Well, as was mentioned, I grew up in Gary, Indiana, And as I was growing up, I looked around and I said, my view is if this was working well, I didn't know what working badly meant. Because I saw an economy that at that point was viewed, I mean, we now look back at Gary in the 1950s, this period was the golden age of capitalism. It never got better, it got worse after that. So here I was growing up in the golden age of capitalism, and I thought it was pretty bad. So as I was a graduate student, the question I posed myself was, what was wrong with the models, the theories that my teachers were telling me? People like Paul Samuelson and Bob Solow. They were saying things that the economy was very efficient and had all these desirable properties. There was actually a guy at University of Chicago, Gary Becker, who wrote that discrimination can't exist because markets wouldn't allow it. And he was living in the south side of Chicago, where if he just opened up his eyes, he would see discrimination all around him. And it was testimony to the ability of economists to close their eyes that he could write that book. So the question I asked was, what was wrong with the theories that I was being taught? And that's really the beginning of my research agenda. And there were many things wrong, and the question is, what was the critical mistake? And it turned out that it was this assumption about perfect information. So what I think is one of the most important results that I got, theorems that I approved, was that the reason that Adam Smith's invisible hand was invisible was it wasn't there. That is to say, what I showed was that the market was, in general, not efficient. So it wasn't just a few market failures like environmental externalities. There were pervasive market failures that affected every sector of the economy, some more than others. So sectors where information was more important were more likely to be dysfunctional, not working well. And as time has gone on, what I showed has been proven to be increasingly correct. So two of the sectors that were identified as information being very important were the financial sector. They argue, that's what they do, is process information. And the 2008 financial crisis was proof by Theorem. If you needed any more proof that clearly it didn't do what it was supposed to do. The healthcare sector in the United States is the other one that is just, when you go to a doctor, if you knew what the doctor knew, you wouldn't be going to the doctor, right? What the doctor provides you is information about your state of health. But then the problem is, how do you know whether what he's giving you is the right information? So actually, in lots of sectors of the economy, there are called asymmetries of information, where somebody knows something that somebody else doesn't know. In fact, it's pervasive in our economy. The education sector is another sector where if our students knew everything we knew, then we would have nothing to tell them. So inherently, education is about information asymmetries. And again, the problem is, how does the student know that what the teacher is telling them is true or worth anything? And we all know what happened in the United States. Trump sold Trump University. You could spend $35,000 and get zero for it. And we have a very robust private education sector exploiting people like Trump University and trying to do everything they can to make sure the government doesn't regulate them. And they are particularly good at exploiting poor people. And so these are all sectors in where asymmetries of information are very important. So what I want to do in my remaining time is talk about some of the policy, some of the implications of this very simple insight that markets, where there are information asymmetries, don't work anywhere near like markets where there's perfect information work like. What are some of the implications? Talk about one of the important analogies, similarities, a market that's very similar to information, in which we are all involved. Talk about some of the broader implications of the economics of information. So, in terms of the policy implications, an awful lot of policy analysis is predicated on the belief that markets are efficient, and that therefore, if you can just leave it, everything will be taken care of. So without realizing it, Adam Smith's invisible hand theorem is really the basis of an awful lot of policy analysis. And it's particularly strong, you know, if you go to an institution like where the World Bank was. It's not where it is today, but when I arrived at the World Bank, there was this idea called the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus was a set of ideas about good policy for developing countries. It was a consensus not among developing countries. It was a consensus between 15th Street in Washington, which is where U.S. Treasury is, and 19th Street in Washington, which is where the IMF is. So it was a consensus of 4 blocks. But they called it a global consensus, and they called it the Washington Consensus. And it had a whole set of policy predicates about what countries should do. And these were believed very, very strongly. And Africa was the part of the world that suffered the most because of that. The particular variant here was called structural adjustment programs. And the result of the structural adjustment programs in Africa was deindustrialization. So after 25 years of structural adjustment, Africa was less industrialized than it was before, and it was the same 25 years while East Asia was going through the East Asia miracle, growing through industrialization. So I blame actually the IMF, the World Bank, and the Washington Consensus a lot. You know, it's not the only factor, but this policy prescription has a lot to do with some of the problems on the continent today. The part of the underlying mistake that they made is they had a very static view of the world. So there was no learning. It was just there was no information problem. And they believed that markets automatically would work well. So you took away government marketing boards, and by magic, the private sector would come in with competitive marketing boards, and agriculture would do very well. So it had these strong, I would say, almost religious beliefs about the fact that markets would solve all problems, and they didn't. And the contrast was, I say, very much with what was going on in East Asia, where they didn't adopt these set of ideas. They said it was very important to have the government play a role in what was called the developing state. One has to understand where some of the countries in East Asia were at the beginning of this period. Korea, which is now, one of advanced countries in many ways, but in education level, it's much higher than the United States. Korea's average education level at the beginning of its development process 40 years ago was only 4.3 years. And their government was not a very sophisticated. They'd just gone through a Korean War. And yet, they put aside the Washington Consensus. The prescription that the IMF and World Bank gave for Korea at the beginning of its period after the Korean War was they said to Korea, your comparative advantage, your relative strength, is in growing rice. And so you should go and become rice farmers. And Korea's response was, thank you, but no thank you. Even if we are the most successful rice farmers in the world, we won't be very well off. And no country had been successful by being rice farmers. So they said, we want to do something else. And they began a process of industrialization. And the result was that in a short period of time, their per capita income increased 10-fold. And in a sense, they intuitively grasped many of the criticisms that I later raised in terms of the criticisms of the Washington Consensus. They took a pragmatic approach. They weren't doing this on the basis of any economic theory. They were feeling their own way on this. But in the end, they were successful. And now, in retrospect, we can interpret their success through these lenses. So this information revolution that I've just described has actually had now a very big impact on the World Bank, the IMF, and they've come to realize that those, too bad for the countries that had to suffer in the period from 1975 to 2000, but they've now recognized there's an important role, that markets often don't work, there's an important role for industrial policies, for innovation policies, and there are all these other problems that some of which I'm going to talk about. And so, in fact, about a year and a half ago, the chief economists of the World Bank from my tenure on got together with a number of other economists and issued a Stockholm Consensus. Not much better. It was still not in the developing world, but what it said was that the Washington Consensus was wrong, and it enunciated a new set of principles for development, principles which recognized the prevalence of market failures, instances where markets don't succeed, and policies that can help address these market failures. Now, when economists use the word market failures, they're just using this for shorthand for saying instances, aspects of the world in which markets do not lead to efficient outcomes. Economic theory never said that the market would lead to equitable or even socially acceptable outcomes in terms of the distribution of income. All that the market at best would do would be efficient. And what I've tried to argue is it wasn't even efficient. But in terms of equity, there was another important theorem in economics. It was called the second welfare theorem. And that theorem said that you could achieve any efficient outcome through market mechanisms. All that you needed is to have redistribution through what are called lump sum taxes, so that you could rely on competitive markets. If you didn't like the distribution of income, you change that. But the consequence of that theorem was that you could separate out issues of efficiency from issues of distribution. And this was very important because it led a whole host of economists to say that the distribution of income was not important. Or more accurately, what they said was the distribution of income was a subject for political scientists to worry about, but not for economists, not for important people like those devoting themselves to economics. So that was the prevalent view in economics. So strong was this view that Robert Lucas, who is now sort of the high priest at Chicago, and got a Nobel Prize anyway, something like 95, something like that, and wrote that of all the ideas in economics, the most invidious, the most poisonous, was that distribution of income was important. So it wasn't that they ignored the distribution of income. He positively launched an attack on any economist that talked about economics. It was sort of consistent with, we had a presidential candidate who said that to talk about inequality, you should only talk about it in closed rooms in hushed voices. That was Mitt Romney. The information revolution actually said that that was wrong. That in fact you could not separate issues of distribution from issues of economic efficiency. That the two were inextricably linked, and that in some ways when you have excessive inequality, it could lead to inefficiencies in the way the economy functioned. I don't have time to exactly draw the link, but what I want to emphasize is that while these theoretical results, I proved in the late 70s and 80s, and argued that when I was at the World Bank, finally by 2010, took a little while, the IMF, which is not, for those of you who don't know, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it's not a left-wing organization. The IMF was saying that countries ought to be paying a lot of attention to distribution. And the managing director of the IMF, when I asked him, why are you saying this? He said, very simply, because our job is making sure economies work well, and economies that have too much inequality don't function well. And there's a whole host, they have a lot of people doing regressions, doing statistical analyses, and they had shown that that was in fact the case. So now this has become almost a mainstream idea, that in fact you can't separate inequality from efficiency, and that anybody who wants to have sustainable development or sustainable growth has to worry about inequality. So that's another important result that came out of this information revolution. A third idea that it helped highlight was that was another market failure, competition. One of the assumptions that Adam Smith assumed was that markets were very competitive. Adam Smith actually pointed out that markets are often not competitive. So at the one time he says if they're competitive they'll function well, but he's also warned that they often were not competitive. The economics of information helped explain why they weren't competitive. One of the reasons for the lack of competition is lack of information. If you don't know who the potential firms are, you don't know what commodities are what different firms are selling, can't tell the quality of the commodities. All these information imperfections lead in turn to imperfections in competition. So markets where information is imperfect tend to be markets where competition isn't very good. So these reinforce themselves. So you get problems directly from imperfect information, but then you get indirect consequences because you get imperfect competition, you get imperfect capital markets, you get imperfect risk markets. Now, I want to move on to an idea that is very much like information, and in fact is a particular kind of information, and that is knowledge. What is knowledge? Knowledge is just, you can call it information about what the world is like. So in some ways you can actually talk about formally knowledge in the same language, mathematical language, that you can talk about information. So, and so this work has led to a rethinking about the economics of information. One of the aspects, one of the reasons that information is not like a conventional good is that it has some special properties. And knowledge has those same properties. So one of these is what economists call technically a public good. What we mean by a public good is not what most people mean by public good. This is a technical term. It's related to what we call non-rivalrous consumption, that if one person is sitting in a chair, another person can't sit in the same chair, usually. Okay? So if you eat some piece of food, somebody else can't eat it. But that's not true of information or knowledge. If I know something, like when I tell you, you now know the thing that I knew, but I still know it. It's not when I told you, I lose what I know. Thomas Jefferson, who was the third president of the United States, put it much more poetically when he said knowledge was like a candle. When one candle lights the other, it doesn't diminish from the light of the first candle. And he said that without having ever studied economics. But he understood this basic idea of knowledge or information as a public good. The problem with public goods is if there's no cost to somebody else having that information, the efficient thing to do with it is to distribute it freely. But if you distribute it freely, you can't get a return, and it can't be driven by the market. So there's an inherent contradiction between market economics and the production of knowledge. Now, we try to deal with that by creating artificial constructs like intellectual property rights. But intellectual property rights interfere with the efficient use of knowledge. I know something, and I hoard that when it wouldn't cost anything for that, the benefit of that to be given to somebody else. And in some cases, that hoarding of knowledge leads to people dying. And right now in South Africa, there's a big discussion going on about redefining your intellectual property rights regime to make sure that doesn't happen as badly as it happens in other countries. And actually South Africa is leading the way in some of these discussions about redefining intellectual property rights. This is really important because standard economics just took not only information as didn't pay any attention to information, They also didn't pay much attention to knowledge. There was no real economics of knowledge. But knowledge is really more important than almost anything else in increases in standards of living. So economists are supposed to be concerned about what causes economic growth, and yet the core thing that causes economic growth is an accumulation of knowledge. And we don't actually teach our students very much about that. And just to give you, to highlight this point, is the fact that for hundreds of years before the Enlightenment, before 1750 or so, standards of living have not changed at all. Now, data 1,000 years ago are not very good, so I don't want to you to hold me too much to this, but this is a chart showing historical living standards, and it goes back a long way, 1,000 years. And what you see is that nothing happened for most of those 1,000 years until the last 250 years. And first in Europe, and now more recently in Asia, it turned up, and it turned up really remarkably quickly. And that's all about knowledge. Interestingly, just to give you a flavor of how historical data, the English love to keep records, and people have gone back and looked at these records, and this is the real wages of London craftsmen, and you can see there that there's almost no change in the real wages. A couple things help it. The Black Plague was very good for the real wages because you got a shortage of labor, but even that, you can see, is just a little wiggle there back in that period. But nothing really changed until 1800. And the same thing then is true about life expectancies. They have been roughly constant, and then suddenly they changed. And interestingly, now that for the most part there's this process of convergence going on. So what caused this seemingly sudden change? It was the Enlightenment, which was a change in the mindset, which involved questioning authority and recognizing that change was possible. The reason I'm doing this, it's not quite a digression. You'll see at the end, because I'm going to come back to the fact that we are in the United States relitigating the Enlightenment today. And so there's a little, I'm going to try to tie this back before I end. The scientific method provided the systematic way of increasing knowledge. It was a system of, you might call it, trust with verification, building on the knowledge of others. We don't all, every time when we start something, we don't all do it over again. We base it on what others have done, and people have checked that, and that's why you publish your data. It's associated with the creation of important institutions of learning and science, a common understanding of what we mean by knowledge, truth, and scientific uncertainties. This had enormous economic implications, as I've just illustrated. I don't think it was an accident that this change in mindset that I just described was associated with the creation of liberal democracies. And there's a general implication that I'm going to come back to a couple of times, that we cannot separate economics from politics, that markets don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be structured. And how we structure markets affects how they perform, not just in terms of efficiency, but distribution and the accumulation of knowledge. Well, what I want to do now is to pick up on one of the central ideas that I described, which was that imperfect information has led us to have a better understanding of the imperfections of competition and market failures more generally, instances where markets don't work well. And this, in turn, has led to a resolution to helping us reconcile two long competing theories for describing the market, the economy, and explaining inequalities. One set of theories is that associated with Marx, who talked about exploitation. And the other theories were those associated with Smith and Ricardo and Mills, and basically described the economy as the idea that the reason some people get higher income is that they have more skills, more human capital. And so the theory, those of you who took elementary college economics, it was called the marginal productivity theory. And this theory, the marginal productivity theory, was, depending on your view, either an apology for inequality, to say, you know, this is why we have it, or justification of inequality. It said it was trying to talk about the inequality in a way that seemed to be neutral, morally neutral. It just said, we have inequality because some people are more productive than others. And the other view said, well, that may be true, there are differences, but there's another dimension, which is some people have power, and they use that power to exploit others. And the competitive model says nobody has power. You know, you have this fierce competition of different firms. So it's a theory which says it's a world in which you don't even use the word power. It does not appear in any textbook. Well, the information economics has really helped revive this old debate and say, well, actually, there are many instances where power is relevant. There actually has been the development of another mathematical tool called game theory, which gives us a precise set of mathematics to talk about power. So it's information economics combined with these advances in game theory. So the reason why I emphasize this is that in the debates going on right now in the United States about the interpretation of the huge level of inequality that we have in the United States, not as bad as South Africa, but among the advanced countries, the United States has the highest level of inequality. The debate is why, or you know, what has caused this enormous increase in inequality in the last third of a century. And you know, I don't have time really to describe all the magnitude of this increase in inequality, but just a few numbers may give you a little bit of a flavor, and also understand what's happening to Americans' politics. The median income, that's half above and half below, of a full-time male worker in the United States, and it's the lucky ones who are working full-time, is lower today than it was 40-some years ago. So for almost a half century, there's been no increase in incomes for males. At the bottom in the income distribution, real wages in the United States today are the same as they were 60 years ago. So GDP incomes have been growing, but it's all gone to the top 1%. So, and actually now in the United States, in the last few years, life expectancy of white males who are not college graduates have started to decline markedly. So I show you the chart where life expectancy is increasing. That was true in the United States, but recently that's turned around. And it's partly a result of this despair, and partly because we don't have, like every other advanced country recognizes access to health care as a basic human right. We don't. So all these things are building up to lots of inequality. And as I said, there are lots of ways of describing it. The question is, what is going on? The share of labor is going down, but actually the share of capital, as we normally measure it, is going down. And the question is, well, if labor is going down and capital is going down, where is it going? And the answer is monopoly rents, land rents, market power. And so there is a growing consensus that part of the maladies in the United States have to do with the concentration of market power. And you can see it in sector after sector of the United States, this concentration in market power. And obviously that affects the functioning of the economy. It's part of the reason why we have record profits of our corporations, but they're not investing. Our corporations are sitting on more than $2 trillion of cash, but our investment is very low, even in a world where real interest rates were negative. So this is sort of inconsistent with standard views of the way economic systems function. So that brings me to the final topic, because the question is, what is going on? Many people had thought that the new technology, computers, internet, was going to lead to more competition. But it hasn't. It's led to more concentration. And the reason is, when there are homogeneous goods, where all the characteristics can be well specified, you do get better price competition. But in the vast majority of commodities, there are very big differences. I mean, you don't go, there are differences, we are increasingly a service sector economy, and you can't look up what does it mean to be the characteristics of a teacher, or, you can get some information, but it's a very differentiated product. So the price is only one aspect of it. But more important than the advantage that it brought in strengthening competition by providing more information has been that it's increased the ability to exploit, including increased asymmetries of information and market power of those who have differential access to information. And the move to the innovation economy has led to an increased importance of fixed cost, and that in turn has led to a diminishing role of competition. So the nature of the modern economy is that the marginal cost, the extra cost, is very low. The cost of distributing a file is close to zero. You don't have to print books anymore. You can do it in e-book. The marginal cost is zero, but the fixed cost is still there of writing it. So when you have large fixed costs, and low marginal cost, very hard to have a well-functioning competitive economy. So some of these changes that the information economy has brought out has actually diminished the force of competition. But there's another thing that is probably more disturbing, is that the move to the information economy has given market power to those who dominate in grabbing information. So that those platforms, Amazon, Google, that have, and Facebook, that every time, or Apple, every time you communicate, they take all the information and they store it, and they can then use that information to target advertising and to engage in discriminatory pricing. I don't know if you have this experience here, but if you try to search for an airline ticket price, it's constantly changing. And that's because as you search, they're using that information to reprice the ticket that they're charging you. So you have to exploit them, you have to actually be searching on several computers simultaneously. And so you have to outwit them as they try to outwit you. But basically, they're trying to extract what we call the consumer surplus out of you. They're trying to get all the value that you get out of the service. And the result of this is that you get a less competitive economy. They control all the information, and the people who control the information will have market power. So the worry is that we are moving to a world in which a few firms have a disproportionate amount of information and therefore disproportionate market power. And of course, the extent to which this is true will be determined by the rules of the game, privacy rights, who owns one data, and the result. So that's why there is a need for a new regulatory framework for dealing with these issues of information, for ensuring competition. And the interesting thing is that Europe is actually beginning to have a debate about this. The U.S. companies and the U.S. government have said that the reason Europe is doing it is because it's anti-American. That's not really the reason. The reason it's doing it is, why is the United States not doing it, is because the U.S. government is owned by the tech companies. That was a strong way of putting it, but they have undue influence. So we should be passing this legislation, and there is a bill in Congress to try to move more into domain and to restrict some of the abuses. But what is very clear is that this new information economy requires a new regulatory regime. And as I say, it's uncertain how much is needed to ensure a competitive economy, but the minimum is treating the data as a public good and making it publicly available. And there's some detailed proposals of how to do it. The other is, this is a technical term, treating the platforms as a public utility, like telephone companies used to be treated. there's an important lesson for South Africa that you may have heard me refer to Chicago School. For those of you who don't know, what that means is Chicago School is a school of thought developed under the influence of Milton Friedman and a whole group of other people that said that markets were always competitive, and don't worry about markets, they'll take care of, and the best way to ensure a well-functioning economy is to do nothing. And so a very strong doctrine of non-intervention. And that school has had enormous influence around the world, and including in law and economics and regulatory policy. But the trying to make sure that there's competition is absolutely necessary if you're going to have a well-functioning competitive economy, market economy. You can't have a well-functioning market economy if it's dominated in sector after sector by 1, 2, or 3 firms. And of course, South Africa has a long history of having a few firms dominating in many of the sectors of its economy. So this is a particularly important of relevance in South Africa. It's also, I mean, you actually have a better competition law than many other countries, but there's a pushback in South Africa for a more Chicago view of competition policy. One area where there's a lot of debate right now going on in the United States is that how do you judge whether there is adequate competition in the media? And as strange as it may seem, the courts in the United States judge whether there's adequate competition in the media by market power in advertising, as if that was the main product of the media. Whereas some of us think the most important part of the media is the marketplace of ideas and its concentration in the marketplace of ideas. So if you're looking at advertising, you would say, well, print media and TV media are not competitive. So you can have the same person own print and TV and radios. You say those are different. But if you're worried about the marketplace of ideas, you would worry about the same person owning the media in all those areas. And in the United States, the influence of Rupert Murdoch is really palpable. Owning Fox News and Wall Street Journal, there is now unambiguous evidence, that's published now in the academic journals of the influence that they have had in our elections. That the stories that they make up, you can trace out how they affect electoral outcomes. So this is one of the big battles that we are fighting. Well, my own work was always focused on imperfect information, naturally occurring asymmetries of information, and as I began my work, I never thought about the idea of disinformation. The big lie, we thought of that as Nazi Germany. And, but that was those countries, and that's over. But we now are in a world where the issue of deliberately created misinformation, disinformation, for a whole variety of purposes has moved into the center of the policy arena. There is no doubt that the Russians interfered in our election. You know, as I say, there really is no doubt about the fact that they deliberately were engaged in misinformation. The only question is, you know, who put them up to it? What were their motives? What was the magnitude? And there actually were several other sources of disinformation going on in that election. The Republican Party itself, you know, so, and one of the reasons that we don't yet know what kind of policies or how to respond is we don't know the relative importance of these different sources of disinformation. One of the problems is that Facebook hasn't been very forthcoming in releasing the data that it has about this kind of disinformation. And just to give you a feeling of some of you probably watched the late night news in the United States. You know, Facebook has large investors from Russia, so it's easy to draw conspiracy theories, which I wouldn't want to do. But it is certainly a part of the uneasiness that is now going on. But I want to circle back on what I talked about earlier about the Enlightenment. One of the concerns is not only is there misinformation and disinformation, there have been wholesale attacks by Trump, the administration, and the Republican Party on what you might call epistemology, how we know what we know. Attack on scientific institutions and the institutions of verification. You know, the idea that you could, in a straight face, a senior person in the administration would say, well, we have our alternative facts. I mean, it's just, you know, how do you deal with that? You know, it's just, you don't know where to begin. And what is so striking is a willingness to have alternative facts in areas where the truth seems obviously verifiable and has already been verified, like in climate change. You know, and we in the United States are experiencing climate change. You know, you never can be sure any particular act, but the experience of increased extreme weather events is unambiguous. And yet, as all these events are happening, there are people saying, oh, there's no such thing as climate change. And, you know, what do you do with that? At the same time that that's going on, they're deliberately defunding science, and particularly defunding science that challenges them, like on climate change. So it's not to say that we're going to prove something else, we're just going to take away your funding. And to appoint people from the coal industry or lobbyists for these industries to run the Environmental Protection Agency to protect the environment. And they've, but this attack on epistemology, on how we know what the truth is, actually also undermines the functioning of a democratic society. Because if you can't agree on what the facts, what's happened, how do you talk about whether due process has been violated? How do you talk about whether there's been equitable treatment? You can't even begin a conversation on those topics. So I'm sure all of you know about, you know, the what we thought was a novel called 1984, and we are now feel like we are this dystopia is becoming America's reality. And the battle is to try to prevent the normalization of this kind of fake news, and to talk about the importance of science for the advancement of our standard of living, and the importance of the independent media for ascertaining fake news. And all of this, I think, is important, is calling out the president's lies for what they are, that is, lies. I think it was one of the media today compiled the list of the number of lies of the president since he got elected, and it's over 1,200. What? 1,600. 1,600. I mean, it is phenomenal. And these are not little mistakes. These are lies. Well, anyway. So let me conclude. Information economics had a transformative effect on economics and economic policy, providing explanations of phenomena that previously been unexplained. And it's also, I didn't have time to talk about this, it's directly given rise to new sub-branches of economics, something called new institutional economics, trying to explain the institutions as a response to imperfections of information and some of the other consequences of the imperfections of information. One of the achievements of the economics of information was, in fact, as it was so successful in explaining lots of things, it became increasingly clear that there were lots of things that could not explain. And by exposing the things that it could not explain, it gave rise to a new branch of economics called behavioral economics. So, in other words, rational theory with imperfect information could not explain an awful lot of the things that we saw. And at that point we said, well, what other things do we have to change in the theory? And that is what gave rise to behavioral economics. So it was actually information economics that gave rise to behavioral economics. The winner of this year's Nobel Prize was in behavioral economics. Together with other work, it suggested that the economy best be viewed through models which highlight market power and exploitation rather than through the lens of the competitive equilibrium model, and questioning, and in many cases reversing, long-standing presumptions of economic policy. So the presumption today is that market economies are not efficient. And the question is, you have to focus your attention on where the largest inefficiencies are. And a concern particularly with pervasive market power, that means there are interventions that can typically increase both efficiency and equity. And all of this has presented a host of new economic problems requiring new solutions. New technologies, rather than resulting in more competitive economy, as had been hoped, has led to more concentration of market power. The old regulatory mechanism, including antitrust, is inadequate in dealing with these new innovative ways of market exploitation. And there are a whole new set of information problems, which I've just been able to hint at: privacy, transparency, disinformation, which pose an even greater threat to the functioning of our economy and more broadly our democratic society. And I think the magnitude of the threat is only slowly being realized with widespread uncertainties about the best way to respond. And I think at a minimum, I think we have to begin by recognizing the magnitude of the threat that it poses to our basic values, to what you might say values of the Enlightenment, the progress of society, the progress of science and society. And as I said before, we should not have to be relitigating the Enlightenment every day. Much rests on our ability to find adequate, if imperfect, solutions, not only the future of our economy, but of our democratic institutions and our society. Thank you.
Joe, thank you very much for a majestic treatment of how and why our increasing understanding of information has shaped our understanding not just of markets but of all society and also of the political possibilities within society. And Joe has kindly agreed to field one or two questions from the audience. So I'll moderate those, and I'm abusing an asymmetry of power here. But if you could kindly indicate with your hand if you would like to pose a question to Professor Stiglitz. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Professor Stiglitz, you make mention of the fact that fake news has become an increasing phenomenon throughout the world. In South Africa, we have an unfortunate set of political circumstances where information is deliberately withheld and it is misused with the specific intention, I believe, of manipulating markets. I'll cite an example. The 2015 decision by President Jacob Zuma to fire Nhlanhla Nene, who was a respected finance minister. The question that one has to ask is, when decisions of that nature are taken, who knows about those decisions beforehand in the context of market manipulation and shorting of currencies and so on and so forth? To what extent is that phenomenon increasing and likely to become more manifested as time goes forward?
You want me to answer each of them, or you want to take a couple questions?
Well, I think that's a good one. Let's
okay. So in fact, transparency is in politics the same object that economics, what I've been talking about in economics. And they just use different words. They call it transparency, but it's about provision of good information. So I've been advocating for a very long time strong right to know laws, and actually been very engaged in the global civil society movement to have strong right to know laws, which give every citizen the right to know. You know, the presumption is that everything the government does, they're working for you, supposedly, and therefore you would have the right to know what an employee is doing for you on your, you know, as your employee on your behalf. And it's the same thing that we ought to have the right to know what the government does. And so I view this as a very important part of our democratic protections, having the strong right to know laws are all part of transparency. Governments almost everywhere don't like these for good reasons, but I think it's one of the few checks. It's an important check. Sweden has had one for over 200 years, and and usually the reason government doesn't want you to know this, whatever it is because they've been behaving badly, and I maybe tell a little story. I wrote a paper on the subject of secrecy, and governments always want to have, you know, everything is a state secret. The negotiating position of the U.S. in trade agreements was such a high level of state secret that the congressman couldn't find out what it was in the United States. But the corporations could find out. And just a little bit of asymmetry here. I wrote this paper on secrecy, and I identified some people in the U.S. government. This was when I was at the World Bank, who were behaving badly. And the president of the World Bank said, "Is this your resignation letter?" So he persuaded me to take out the names and just publish the paper as an academic paper.
I saw a hand at the back. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. You mentioned at one point that the economists, I think in the Chicago School, had a belief that you regarded as so unfounded that it was almost a religious belief. And so I wonder if this perhaps helps to explain part of the way that information works. And I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit about the fact that information is not rational and that providing more information and more perfect information doesn't seem to have helped in many occasions where, in terms of elections or other forms of important decision making. So I wonder, do you have a theory of information that takes into account its non-rational dimension so that it's not a surprise to discover that economists have religious beliefs about economics?
Well, I mentioned before behavioral economics, which is the response that a lot of people, which takes into account the fact that individuals are not always behaving in a way that is consistent with rationality as we would normally define it. A lot of people when you describe the Nobel Prizes, there have been two that have been given for behavioral economics, and you describe them as saying, economists discovered that people behave irrationally. People say, you get a Nobel Prize for that? But you have to understand the battle, the intellectual battle, that the strength of this particular view that individuals do act rationally has had in the profession. And it is the dominant paradigm that has been taken a long time to overturn. But what I said before that the Enlightenment developed a scientific method, and that what I guess I would say is that a very large fraction of the people in the world, and probably 100% some of the time, act in a way that is inconsistent with the principle, these kind of Enlightenment principles. And it's probably, when I was in the government, it was really quite amazing for me to realize that very few of the people in government really understand science at all. That's not the way they reason, and so I'm perfectly aware of the role of you might say emotional responses, and politics is obviously very sensitive to trying to cultivate those emotional responses. But I guess as a society, I think we have to work to try to, I view this as at the core of educational institutions, is to try to understand both, you might say, the scientific method and the limits of science, and the limits of our own degree of rationality.
We can go on for a long time, but I'm going to ask Professor Geyer to draw this to a close. There will be more opportunity for the discussion later on, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Geyer.
Thank you, Stan. I really have nothing to add to the appreciation that you've already expressed towards Professor Stiglitz. What I want to share with you is the fact that Protea Bookstore has kindly brought along a number of copies of his work, including this one, The Euro and Its Threat to the Future of Europe. So you will be able to buy a copy if you would so please, and there are other titles available too. I specifically want to acknowledge the support that has been crucial for STIAS to be able to invite Professor Stiglitz here. The Donald Gordon Foundation, and by name Ms. Wendy Applebaum, who have been staunch supporters and funders of the STIAS program over many years. as well as Remgro, and by name the CEO, Mr. Jannie Durant, for the generous way in which they have been involved in the logistics of this visit. And then finally, I hope you have budgeted for some time to spend with us afterwards, and if not, that what you will experience when you go outside now will convince you that it is worthwhile to linger a little longer and enjoy the occasion for quite some time. I'm not sure that there are unlimited supplies of wine, but you can put us to the test. Thank you again for your presence.